Welcome to The Composer's Life. I'm Nadia, your host, a fellow composer and film score writer. This podcast is all things composition, composers' day-to-day life, resources, advice, and interviews. Today, I had the pleasure of interviewing one of my professors from Berklee College of Music, Timothy Huling. He is a composer, orchestrator, producer, and conductor of music for film, games, other media, and the concert hall. Tim has enjoyed symphonic premieres such as Symphonic Stories, the multimedia orchestral event Origins, Life in the Universe, the recent performance of the woodwind octet Into the Forest of Strange Beasts, and the upcoming premiere of a concerto for saxophone. Tim has worked in various capacities on award-winning film music, game music, musical theater, and other hard-to-classify projects. Tim currently teaches in the screen scoring department at Berklee College of Music. So sit back and enjoy the interview for today. Welcome to the podcast, Tim Huling.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you for coming on today. I'm really excited to hear more about your career in life. So I will just get into the first question.
Wonderful.
What is the first instrument that you ever played?
Let's see. Getting in the Wayback Machine here. I suppose it was piano. There might have been something before that I don't remember. I come from a very musical family. My grandmother was a concert pianist and church organist and music theory teacher. And so there's a lot of piano in the family. And my earliest memories are of playing piano and taking piano lessons. My parents bought me a keyboard to practice at home. And my mom, my parents actually, they were both kind of fans of, I guess, performing early music a little bit in the house, mostly my mom, but my dad played some recorder with her at some point, I think before I was born maybe. And they had built a harpsichord. And there was this thing you could buy at that. You probably still can, but this, I think it was called, the company's called Zuckerman, and they made a kind of kit that you could build a harpsichord out of. It was, quite a project, I think, to put it together, and so they had done that. I believe in their little one-bedroom apartment in the San Diego area. Before I was born. And so probably the first instrument I played was a harpsichord. So I guess my mom or my parents decided that the harpsichord wasn't really the right instrument for me to be practicing on. So they got this keyboard. It was this, this certainly ages me, but it was the year before, I believe, the MIDI became publicly available or commercially available. So my mom had told the story that one year after the keyboard, they had bought the keyboard, MIDI came out, and they were like, "Oh, we didn't get a MIDI keyboard. Does that matter?" So this would have been the early 80s. And I remember doing some transcription on my own onto the simple little sequencer that was on that keyboard of like the jingle for a Cheerios ad or something like that. I don't know how old I was when I did that, but I think I was pretty young, like a grade school age kid or something. So that was the start. And then I did not play piano. That was my primary instrument growing up.
So when you started getting into music, did your parents have you start taking lessons, or did you kind of just do it on your own?
Yeah, well, both. I did start. I did have lessons on piano. It was one of those word of mouth things where my mom, a friend of hers at work, recommended someone, and there was this nice old lady that I used to go to her house. I remember being there, and I remember her saying to me, I remember sitting at her upright piano in this little, kind of living room, and staring at the music, and I remember her saying, "Just play something." So apparently trying to read the music had me frozen. And I was like, just trying to be so careful. And she just play something. and so after a year or so that, she retired. And so then I didn't have lessons for a few years or something. I don't remember anything else in there, but I was still playing at this little keyboard and making music up, I believe. I'm not sure how much of that I was doing. And then in fourth grade, I decided I wanted to play saxophone. And and so that started a woodwind journey. My mom found a teacher at a little music store, who then became my teacher for the next 10 years. And he insisted that I start on clarinet. So I played clarinet for 3 years, which it was the right choice. It's a good thing to do. And then I moved to saxophone, played that through college, circled back to clarinet as a woodwind doubler in college, and then also picked up flute at that time too.
What's the benefit of starting on clarinet?
Um, yeah, so the clarinet embouchure, meaning the technique with your mouth, basically, is apparently, I actually don't know much about it, but there are, woodwind folks who believe that starting on the clarinet and building a proper clarinet embouchure is good on the way to saxophone. Also, it's better than going the other direction. That if you start on saxophone and then you try to move to clarinet, the saxophone embouchure is not good training for the clarinet. And I think it's just basically about directionality. The saxophone being kind of straight out, and the clarinet going more straight down. Often, saxophone players who pick up a clarinet will play it like they want to play it more straight out from themselves, and that doesn't produce a good tone and isn't good technique. And then also the fact that the clarinet being an open hold instrument, you have to be more precise with your fingers, and that is good on the way to saxophone, but the other way around again is not, because saxophone, if you start on saxophone, you could be there's a little more it's a little more forgiving with regard to sort of finger placement, and then you can end up, as you move to clarinet, just instinctually not being quite as precise, and you get a lot of squeaks that way if you miss the holes on a clarinet.
That's so interesting. So basically, all the technique that you learn on clarinet will just make you a better saxophone player.
Yeah, that's the theory anyway. And yeah, so it's an interesting relationship with the fingerings, because the one register of the clarinet has the same fingerings as both registers of the saxophone. They're kind of cousins as instruments.
So, as a teenager, what made you decide, at like what point did you decide you wanted to go to college and actually pursue music as a career?
Yeah, yeah. So the idea in my family, college wasn't really an option. It was the thing you do next. I'm There are a lot of academics in my family, and I think I'm a fourth generation college professor.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, a third or fourth generation. So, and there are probably others, back further. So very academic, and my mom worked at the University of Washington for her whole career on staff. My parents were teachers when they were young, actually in the Peace Corps in Ethiopia.
Wow.
And then I've got relatives on both sides that are teachers, and everyone's got degrees. So it wasn't really an option, and nor would I have been interested in like not going to college. And when I was young, I had all kinds of ideas about what I might want to do with my life. There was one point where I wanted to be an archaeologist. That might have had something to do with Indiana Jones.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and when I was even younger, I actually wanted to be a paleontologist. Basically, one of many kids wowed by dinosaurs. Yeah, but then at a certain point in my childhood, I started, making up music, and I just kept coming back to music as the as my passion, and so then it was a question of, okay, well, what does this mean? Like what kind of life does a person have doing this? And realized pretty early on that I wasn't interested in being a performer. My performance opportunities were primarily jazz, obviously as a sax player, right? And I had a great time with that, and it was a wonderful way to develop as a musician, and as a composer. The playing jazz kind of well. Requires a level of understanding of music that is extremely beneficial for someone who's then going to compose. And I think it's a language and a paradigm that is very useful. But I knew I didn't want to try to be a jazz musician. For a couple of different reasons. It was, I was never as there was, I don't know, I think I had a lot of anxiety on stage, and but I loved making music, you know, in other ways. And so I figured, okay, I want to be a composer. I didn't really know what the possibilities were. And this was before the internet, so looking things up was a little more challenging. And or actually, it was at around the birth of the internet. um, and so the internet was populating with information as I thought about this, but it wasn't there yet. And so, yeah, basically, I decided, okay, I want to be a composer, and I need to figure out what kind of life that would be. I spent 1 year at Western Washington University because I'm from Seattle, and that's up in Bellingham in the northwest corner of America. And I actually went there knowing I probably wasn't going to stay, um, because I believed that it wasn't really the right music department for me, but I needed to figure some things out, and I hadn't done that yet. And So I was there, and the reason that I chose it was that the just the information they had in this sort of published book about themselves. It mentioned that your senior recital, if you're a composition major, is the performance of your compositions, whereas other schools, the senior recital was performance on your instrument, no matter what your degree was, no matter what your focus was. And so I was like, okay, that sounds like a school that's more supportive and focused on composition. And that's not a lot of information to go on. But I did go there, and what I discovered when I got there was that the the school as a whole, the university as a whole, was a lot of its focus was on educating people to be teachers, and that was its historical kind of niche in the state of Washington. And I think it was maybe even originally created for that purpose. And so, in any case, I was like, okay, I'm not going to stay here. Where am I going to go? I looked at Eastman. I mean, I sort of looked at every school one might, and then somebody dropped a Berklee catalog in my lap when I mentioned that I thought I might want to write music for film. And because I'd watched a movie and was like, oh, wait, this music, I like this music, and I love movies. So maybe this is the answer. Yeah, so that's, all of a sudden it was like, oh, there it is. And Berklee's background as a jazz school, partly the film scoring program, it all just really clicked for me. Yeah.
So you kind of used your first university as like a stepping stone to get to figure out what you wanted to do exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
What was the program like versus how it is today? Was it different?
At Berklee?
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, the film scoring major is, honestly, it is what. So it was great when I was there in the '90s, and there were things that we wished we were doing that we're doing now. Um, so, like for example, when I was a student at Berklee in the '90s, there were like literally half a dozen string players in the entire school.
really?
Yeah,
Wow.
it was just not known as a place for string players to come and study. And so in the intervening 20 some years, the string department exploded basically, and Berklee did a great job after that. Building a program for string players. I think on multiple fronts. I don't know a lot about it, but on the one hand, things like American Roots and playing, things that are more fiddle focused. But on the other hand, being a program for a string player to study playing those instruments. And then, of course, the partnership with Boston Conservatory, or the merger, I should say, with Boston Conservatory, has opened up even more kind of player resources. So when I was a student, the well, obviously there are string players in Boston, and so there were people around. But if you wanted strings to play for your projects, it was a little more challenging. There was a young woman who played cello at Berklee, and she would literally run away from you because I remember her scampering down the hallway with her, her wheeled cello case, because she would just get accosted everywhere she went by people who wanted her to play, would hope that she would volunteer to play for their recording sessions, whether it be film scoring majors or anybody else. And so, yeah, the recording we have, Berklee now has the 160 building, as we call it, with these incredible recording facilities. Berklee had amazing recording facilities when I was a student, but we have even more, and we have a room that's bigger to do a larger ensemble, that sort of thing. We have more opportunities for students to collaborate with student filmmakers. When I was a student, we had a lot of great projects as our assignments, but we weren't collaborating with student filmmakers, and there's more of that now. So yeah, there's just kind of more now. Of course, technology has changed a lot. When I was a student, the current set of tools that a composer needs to learn how to use were it really was a moment of pivot, I think, for the world of film scoring towards, for lack of a better word, digital production. That had started, but it was very different. The computing power was 0.01%, probably literally, of what it is now. And so, yeah, so there was so everything that we're doing now was sort of was coming into being at that time. So yeah.
When you were studying film scoring there, did it kind of click for you more as you were studying?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I was at that time in my life, especially, was kind of concerned about was, okay, I love writing music. It's this deeply enchanting experience for me, but let's get real. Like, how do you make a life? How do you have a job? I mean, one of the great ironies of my life is that at that time, if there was one thing I knew, it was that I didn't want to be a professor. And so now here I am, very happy as a professor. But maybe that thought, that idea, led me towards being a professor of film scoring, which I'm very happy to be. So in any case, yeah. So I just thought, okay, but how do you actually do this? Like, how do you make a life as a composer? And I wasn't getting real guidance on that question. And it was harder to seek people out. Although in hindsight, as a child, or as a teenager, it would have been good if I had just sort of tried to talk to somebody about, how do you be a composer? In any case, yeah. So when I was at Berklee, the minute I stepped into Berklee, I felt like, oh, this place is connected to the rest of the world. Whereas, there was this kind of ivory tower experience at other places where it felt like the music departments were disconnected from anything other than themselves. I think that is not true anymore. I generally feel that the quote unquote music academy is less isolated than it was 25 years ago, both artistically and in terms of community and connection to the rest of the world. Yeah, so I felt I was relieved and excited when I got to Berklee for that reason. I was fortunate because my background as a person who had studied jazz formally and listened in deeply and also had some formal training in quote unquote classical music, and was a big fan of, like, rock and grunge coming from Seattle. And I actually had a friend whose dad had his own recording studio, so I had like hung out and played around with his equipment because he let us do that, amazingly. So I had all of that background, made me just really compatible with Berklee. I think because I was a year older, I came in with a little more maturity than I would have otherwise, and I had a year of college behind me, and so I kind of knew how to be a college student. So I
It
really,
makes a big difference at that age, like a bigger difference than you would think.
yeah, it really does. So yeah, and it did. I'm sure it did for me. And so, that all of that background really set me up for success at Berklee, and I felt like I really got Berklee. And especially once I arrived and met my professors and met both in the film score department and outside of it, um, I felt very much at home, and that I was getting training that was going to really launch me in a way that would work. And yeah, but I felt singularly at home in the film scoring department, which we now, of course, call the screen scoring department. I felt like I'd found my people there. And I think it was partly the mix of creativity and artistry with practicality that I really felt I was like that.
Yeah, you found the place, the niche that you belonged in. So once you had graduated Berklee, did you know what you were going to do afterwards, or did you kind of step out?
Yeah. So that last semester that I was at Berklee, I was like blind with panic. And in hindsight, of course, I sort of want to comfort my former self, not just because everything worked out, but just, I look back and I think I only had to take care of myself. Why was I freaking out? um, and Berklee, my professors did do a great job explaining to me how the industry works. And in the end, it was Berklee, the chair of the department, Don Wilkins, who was one of the founders of the program, of the department, and was the chair then, who connected me with somebody, a composer by the name of Hummy Man, and that introduction was huge for the launch of my career. But in that last semester, before I had the meeting with Dawn, that connected me with Hummy, I was like, what am I going to do? And I think part of it was that I had friends who were already finding ways to get started, and I hadn't. But here's a very strange story that happened to me. So at that time, this was 1998, the spring of 1998. I was wandering around Boston, just sort of listless with worry about what I was going to do, and I wandered into the at that time brand new Nike store. So they used to be called, I don't think they use this term anymore, but Nike, the shoe company, had just started opening actual stores, as opposed to just having a product that would sell in other stores. And they called them Nike Town. That was the name, Nike Town. And so there was a new Nike Town on Newbury Street. And I wandered in, and I noticed that there was like sound effects in the space, that if you went into one area, like an area where they were selling golf clubs or something, you would hear the sounds of golf. And if you walked into the area where they're selling trainers, tennis shoes, you would hear like squeaking of like a sneaker on a basketball court, and the sound of a hoop. And if I remember right, I believe it was even dynamic and interactive, that as you walked into the space, you were actually triggering the sound happening. And this just was amazing to me. And I thought, I could do that. That's something I could do. And because I was sort of like always looking for what could I do? And obviously that's not music, but the idea of like multimedia audio, it's like, okay, that's in the big basket of things that includes music for film. And I was like, I could do that. And so whatever, I just had that. So fast forward about only 6 months. And by basically coincidence, I was working at the recording studio that had done that specific installation. So basically, when I moved home to Seattle, a friend of mine recommended that I just start calling recording studios, which didn't feel like something that was quite appropriate for me to do as someone who was a composer and not a recording engineer. But she said, they're the ones who know what's going on in town. Just start calling them. And so I did. And it was true. They were, recording studios were these kind of, hubs of activity where people were coming and going. And so therefore it was a place to meet people if you were there. And so I ended up having several meetings with recording studio, owners or people who worked in studios, including this one that was called Odyssey, which is spelled Audisee. And they, had this great meeting. And then a few months later, they called me back and hired me to be a sort of second engineer, sort of general employee. And that's when I discovered they were the people who had done that installation at Nike Town.
Wow, what are the odds?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And then there was another coincidence like that too, where that recording studio had. So back then, so there's a thing called library music, right, where people have produced music that can be licensed. And back then, library music was more like a library where you would, I mean, not like, a quiet place to read a book, but it was basically if you were an organization that wanted to, have the library, you would get a delivery of CDs. And so Odyssey was a place where that was one of the things they offered was music library services. And so we had a wall of about 1,000 CDs or more that were these libraries. And so sometimes clients would come in and look for music to license, and I would help them. And basically, I remember at one point I was like, okay, how do I get on the other side of this? How do I be the composer who's writing the music for this library, which at the time was harder than it is now. And so I remember having that thought. And then about a year later, I was working on the music as an orchestrator, actually, for my friend, for one of those libraries. And I was in the studio with the very people I used to talk on the phone with as their kind of representative in Seattle. So it's a funny journey.
When you met with the chair at the time, were you going in because you didn't know what to do?
Yeah, basically what I told him was, I remember my exact words. I said, you know, I'm finishing here. It's my last week of school, and I'll probably move to LA. I would rather move to New York. I'm trying to figure out what to do, but in the meantime, I'm going to move home to Seattle. And I thought I should try to find work while I'm there. I don't know how long I'll stay, but I should, try to get my feet wet, as we say, while I am in Seattle. And I wasn't aware of this, but shortly before that moment, the department had given a distinguished alumnus award to an alumnus of Berklee named Hummy Man. And he had a few years before that moved to the Seattle area, so he was there, and so Don, he said, well, there's this guy named Hummy Man, and I actually knew his name because when I had first walked into the film scoring department as a student, the very first time I walked in, I noticed, they had posters up on the walls of movies that were scored by alums of Berklee. And I was so wowed by that, and I was really paying attention to film composers' names for the first time in my life. And, other than John Williams. And, and I basically went over, and there was a poster for the movie Robin Hood Men in Tights. That had come out a few years before, like in the early 90s, I guess. And so I had been aware of that movie when I was like a high school kid or whatever. And I walked up to the poster and I looked at the what's called the billing block, which is all those names at the bottom that are always in the same font that say who was involved in a movie. And it said, music composed or music by Hummy Man. And I remember looking at that name thinking, wow, what is that name? And so I actually remember thinking, well, that's a memorable name. That's probably good for a person's career to have such a memorable name. So then 3 years later was when I was sitting with Don having this meeting, and he goes, there's this guy named Hummy Man. And I'm like, unbelievable. That was the first name I saw basically when I walked in the department. And so he connected me with Hummy. And I was very nervous to call him that summer, because I stayed in Boston the summer after I graduated from Berklee. And so I was sitting in my apartment, just super nervous to pick up the phone and call Hummy. And I called him, and he said to me, "Oh yeah, hi, Don said you were going to call me. I'm super busy. Call me back in 2 weeks." And he hung up the phone. And I was just relieved to have made the call. And so then, make a long story a little shorter, I did call him back. It was a little more than 2 weeks. But when I got back to Seattle, and I went over to his place, we had a long meeting on like a Tuesday afternoon. I had this beautiful house with a recording studio in the basement. And I thought, wow, this is the life. And then 6 months later, I was able to reintroduce myself to him at a kind of networking event. And then a few months after that, he hired me to work with him because he got busy with a TV movie, a miniseries, a 2-part miniseries that was being produced about the life of P.T. Barnum. And so that was my first kind of like significant gig. It was just about exactly 1 year after I graduated from Berklee. Almost to the day, actually, that we were in the recording studio, recording an orchestra. And so I was sort of his assistant for that. And he gave me I did a little bit of orchestrating or kind of more arranging for that of like source music that was needed for the movie. And I was otherwise just sort of the person who was available to help in any way on that project.
Did you feel outside of your comfort zone when you started working with him?
You know what? I didn't. And the main reason was I I was amazed actually that when I arrived at his studio, and well, especially once we got started working, somewhere in there in the early days, I saw that he was working in the way that I had been taught to work. And I was like, wow, okay, I guess what I was taught was correct and relevant, because here's this, high level professional who's doing this work in the way I was taught to do it. So that was relieving and exciting. And yeah, we had a good rapport right out of the gate. And so that was good.
How long did you work with Hummy Man? That's his name, right?
Yeah.
And then where did you go afterwards?
Yeah. So what happened for me, I started there when I actually started working with him, it was the spring of 99. And then it was sort of off and on a little bit. And then there were some years in there where I was his kind of assistant in a part-time but daily capacity. But then also Hummy started a school of film scoring right just slightly before I met him. And it sort of started as a fairly casual evening program where he had 2 classes. I think he called them Film Scoring 1 and Film Scoring 2. The first one was discussing the fundamentals of film music and orchestration. And then Film Scoring 2 was you score a short film, and he would get a community orchestra together of volunteer players and go into a studio and record. And so that was pretty intense. And but he could see a growth potential for that little program that he had created. And he wanted to the way it started was he wanted to document what he was even doing in the class. And so he asked me to come and take notes. And so I would sit as he gave his lectures, I would take notes. And then it expanded into something that had like 3 courses, because he realized he was trying to do too much in the first course. And then it was 4 courses. And then he started to reach out to people and say, hey, if you want to teach a class in this thing I've made, you're welcome to it. He sort of made it almost like open source, for lack of a better word. And so I started teaching like a sort of music theory course, and then a finale notation course, and it's just kind of grew, and it became a 2-year program, and then it eventually got to a point where it had just gotten too big for its own, you know, for the way we were trying to do it, and it became a master's degree. Which
Wow.
easier said than done, and this was over the course of 15 years.
Was he doing it through a university or a school, or did he literally just start it on his own?
Yeah. So what happened was it was an interesting kind of winding road as it grew. I mean, one of the big it's funny, one of the so a few years into the existence of the program, I don't know how many years, maybe 5 years. Somebody encouraged Hummy to build a website for the program, and so he did that. Worked with somebody to build a website, and like kind of right away, he started getting emails from people all over the world saying, "When are you going to do a summer program that I could come and be a part of?" And he's like, "Oh, I didn't think of that." At least that's how I remember it. And so we created a 2-week summer program in film scoring, and that was fascinating and exciting and fun to do. We would like take over spaces in hotels and run the program in their meeting rooms and stuff. And so that went on for quite a while. And that so the program just kind of grew in these various ways, and then yeah, we just got to this place where we realized, okay, the scope of what we're trying to do, it just needs to be a formal full-time degree program. And we discovered that in order to really make that work, it had to be really a degree. And the reason was that that was the only way for students to gain access to loans. Um, there was a way for a program that wasn't technically a degree for students to get loans, but it was really limited and in such a way that you probably wouldn't be able to get students. And so, yeah, we had this kind of partnership over the years with another school called the Seattle Film Institute. And so in the end, what made sense was to partner with the Seattle Film Institute. So the film scoring degree that we had created was became well, it was called the Pacific Northwest Film Scoring Program, and it became part of the Seattle Film Institute as a master's degree. Yeah, and so it's sort of the music department inside the Seattle Film Institute. And so, yeah, so I was a part of all of that, and ended up with administrative tasks and stuff as well as teaching. And that went on continuously from when I started with him in '99 until 2014. So I rode that whole journey from it being just the evening classes where we, rented a room in a community center up to it being this master's degree. And that's been around now since 2000. I want to say 2011. That degree has been in existence, and then I pivoted back to Berklee. At that time. So I always had this through line of a life as an educator, and I did some other things along the way as well. But a lot of that was with him, with Hummy, and then yeah. So then what happened for me outside of teaching, after working with Hummy in various ways for a few years, I started to branch out and look for other work opportunities, and also some of my friends from college got busier and busier, and some of them sometimes would hire me to orchestrate for them. So I was orchestrating on projects in New York and in LA and other places, and I would meet people around Seattle that needed either music for their media or composers who needed an orchestrator. I was lucky in that, at that time, so now we're talking about like the early 2000s, the gaming industry went from huge to gargantuan, and there was a greater need for music professionals to be a part of they basically the how should I put this, game composers had both the financial and technical resources to do more at that time, and they needed bigger teams. And whether it be players or recording studios or orchestrators. And so I got to jump onto those opportunities because I was in the right place at the right time, and I had already met some of the right people. So so I started working in games in the early 2000s, mostly as an orchestrator, kind of off and on over the years. And yeah.
Between composing and orchestrating, do you have a preference of what you like to do?
Well, my honestly, my true preference is to be doing both, and there's a few different reasons for that. They basically have different upsides, and I like to go back and forth between them. The nice thing about working as an orchestrator is that by definition you're working with live players, and so you get to go into the studio and hang out with your friends and make music with world class musicians and 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 have that experience. And even in the months running up to the gig, your creative experience is fully focused on the sort of envisioning the live players, and so your mental sort of experience is that even if the recording sessions are just sort of like the party at the end almost of the gig. But you're in the studio, you're working with live players, and that's a lot of fun. Also, I like being part of a music team. I like that. I like it when my collaborators are composers and musicians. That you can kind of relax into the relationship because it's very natural to be talking about music with musicians. Um, and Yeah, and it's fun. And the sort of puzzle of being an orchestrator and the problem solving kind of has a certain kind of interest for me in the way my brain works. So and being in a support role has its own kind of fulfillment. And then but it's not your music, and so that's the reality. And so then composing, you are writing your own music, speaking in your own voice fully, which is satisfying. And then scoring a scene in a film or writing music for a game, that that creative act where you're crossing the bridge, so to speak, between the musical and the non-musical is a very special thing creatively, especially for me, writing music, that is underscore for a film. Being in that kind of dynamic, responsive relationship with the film itself and helping evoke the kind of spirit and emotion of the movie is a very special experience creatively. Um, Also, the collaboration with a filmmaker, it can be great. Being in that creative dynamic, where you are coming to understand what their vision is and then realizing it through music, it can be a beautiful experience. It can also be fraught. It can be a challenging thing to read the tea leaves of what the filmmaker needs, and understand their needs and their vision. And so, being an orchestrator, you don't have to worry about that in the same way. But being a composer, you get to do that. So it's an interesting contrast. But the other chapter for me is that I got into writing concert music as well, about 15 years ago, and so that's been a lot of fun for me, to write concert works and have them premiered, in the kind of, I don't know. I want to say second half, but that's not quite accurate. Sort of about 10 years into my career, I started to really seriously pursue that. And mostly it's just been something that I made for myself. I just sort of made opportunities, starting with putting on chamber music concerts with other composers, and then just kind of just doing it.
So when you write concert music, I'm assuming you kind of have the freedom to do whatever kind of thing you want to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. It's a very different environment creatively, on a number of levels. Of course, the drivers of the creative choices are. can be just a completely different paradigm as a composer. You can sort of still be a story, quote unquote, storyteller, or have a narrative arc and a emotional push to your concert music. And that plus a title, and it's sort of like you're telling a story. I mean, I resist the idea that composers are storytellers, but I think that we evoke story and we evoke the spirit of the human experience. And I think that in film music and in media music, we support and respond to story and help structure and tell the story. And sometimes we are actually telling the story. Sometimes a theme comes into a film score and it's the only thing in the movie that's telling you something about the story. So in any case, in concert music, I think a lot of film composers experience a kind of creative vertigo when they write concert music, because they're like, well, I could write anything. Ooh, which
There's no boundaries.
yeah, you feel this sort of like, whoa, 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 whoa. There's nothing to bounce off of or push back on. Um, and so that can be disorienting. And so then you find, okay, what is the purpose of this piece of music? What is the driver of it? What am I trying to do? And it can become a very different thing. I mean, sometimes when I write concert music, I want to explore a certain compositional technique or a combination of instruments. Or give myself new challenges in various both technical and creative ways, structurally, harmonically, instrumentation wise. And so that is fun and interesting. I find myself going back to the narrative instinct as a concert composer, where I write pieces that both seem to have a story structure vaguely, the kind of beginning, middle, and end, where there seems to be some kind of tension built in that is reaching a place of resolution um, as the story goes. I mean, it's not a story, but as the piece continues, and yeah. So, but it's been a lot of fun for me, and what I find, what I also am interested in exploring is the use of modernist compositional techniques in a fashion that is broadly appealing to a general audience. That to me is an interesting place to try to discover as an artist. And I think that there's more, I don't know really, and I've been curious to do some kind of research project to this on this question, but I do think that the overarching kind of, well, there isn't an overarching, but I think there are more people in the world of concert music who are also interested in that, to write music that is both artistically fascinating, has its place in the flow of music history, um, and is not so esoteric as to be only appealing to the initiated, but might have a broad appeal. So how do you find that kind of duality? And so I think that probably puts me in a place of being something like a neo-romantic in my writing, where my some of the techniques are very much modernist, but they are still they have at their core ideas around tension and resolution that are slightly more old school, if that makes sense. But yeah, the concert music writing environment, it can be a lot of fun if you can get it. The fact that you're just writing the piece and then people play it is interesting, as opposed to like, okay, I wrote this thing. What do you think? Does it work? That kind of, I'm sure it varies. And there are probably situations where composers of concert music are in a kind of collaboration with probably a conductor. Um, the My experience though has always been, I wrote it, here it is, play it. And I think probably the question of whether or not it was successful as far as the ensemble is concerned is whether or not you get invited back.
Gotcha.
I'm
So you
gonna.
get the feedback after
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
happened.
yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. How do you balance doing projects and writing for concert and stuff like that with being a professor?
Um, it's tricky, and I think that, I mean, this is the question for academics across disciplines: is the balancing the different goals that you have for your career. The And I think that for academics generally, the if you want to be writing, whatever that means in your field, or doing the research or doing the work other than teaching, one of the goals is to find a teaching job that supports that, and gives space for that. Um, the And Berklee is great in that Berklee is a place that comprises professors who are active in their fields, and so the it's kind of in the bones of the institution that you will stay active in your field, and there those are. I mean, it's explicitly expected of professors. Like, what are you doing in the field? That's part of your like job review. Um, and so yeah, so there's that push to do that. Obviously, I'm in the film scoring department, so the expectation, which I'm happy to take on, is to stay active in media. And I said film scoring department, but it's actually the screen scoring department, where I'm teaching. And so I'm, and in fact, my work in both film and games is that. And then the concert music thing, it's just something that I just have to make space for if I want to. And so they're basically, what I do is, luckily the for me, when I do that sort of thing, the timeline is pretty long term. And so I have, I can look at my life and say, okay, when will I actually have time to write some concert music? And that changes, because I'm like, I thought I was going to have time, and then I just got called for this gig. So guess what? I'm not going to have time. Um, but honestly, what it boils down to is the summer. I teach in the summer, but I teach a load that's effectively part time, and so I have time to do other projects in the summer. And so that's so like right now I'm writing to sort of bring it all together. I'm writing a saxophone concerto, which I've just gotten started on, and I'll be working on this summer. There's a guy, a professor at New England Conservatory named Bill Drury, who runs ensembles there and wind ensembles. And I just, if I remember right, I sort of cold emailed him at a certain point, and just up the street at Berklee, and he was very, very nice guy, very receptive, and does a great job down there at New England Conservatory, and was happy to program some of my music for his ensemble. Yeah, there's one ensemble in particular of his that I write for, and so I wrote a piece a few years ago for them to play, and then he suggested I lengthen it, make it a multi-movement piece, and so I wrote that, and they played that. About 6 months ago, and then I told him, hey, I want to write a saxophone concerto, and he's like, great, do it. And so I'm doing that, and they'll play that next year.
What advice? Well, I don't know which, you can decide which question you want to answer. So the first one is, what do you hope your students take away from your classes? And the second is, what advice would you give for people who want to pursue a career in film scoring? I'm not sure if those are too similar or.
Yeah. So advice that I would give for people pursuing a career in film scoring. I mean, obviously, come and study with us at Berklee. We do a great job. Teaching the art, the craft, the business, the technology of film scoring. And another thing that is super important is getting connected to, the quote unquote industry or community of fellow creators. And both just by being a community of film and game composers, we afford that opportunity. And then also, the world is very well populated with Berklee grads who are working. And so there's an opportunity through those, both with other Berklee grads and with folks in the industries that we're connected to get sort of plugged in to the work by coming through our doors. And so the larger thing is to find collaborators and find people to make art with, and studying and listening deeply to music in film, and giving that a close analysis to understand how does the music relate to the story and to the film and to the performances and to the world of the film. Getting deeply steeped in the tradition and vocabularies of film music. And coming to us and learning the techniques and technology as well as the art, is a great thing to do. But one of the things that what I guess probably the most important thing is, if you want to be a film composer, is to meet filmmakers, and to just get out there into the world and find them and come to know them. Probably people who are at a similar place in their lives as you, both from a career standpoint and from a personal standpoint. That feels like the most likely to succeed. And the good news is it's we're also connected now. That's a lot easier than it used to be. When I was graduating, I was like, people would say this, and I'm like, okay, fine, but where are they? Are they in that building? Are they in that building? I mean, where are the filmmakers?
And how do I
And
get into
how
that
do
building?
I like get their attention? And so what I discovered is that what you have to do is figure out, where do they congregate, and then go where they congregate, whether that be a certain city or a certain event, and then also figuring out ways to enter that space of congregation in a way that you're more likely to be, I don't know, interesting. And so, for example, the one obvious idea is film festivals. So, okay, go to film festivals, especially if the filmmakers are going to be present for the premieres of their films. So that's good. You can literally be in the room with a filmmaker who succeeded in making a movie and got it into a festival and got it up on the screen. And then you can walk up to that person, and so that's fine. But that's not ideal, because this person is, they already made a movie. There was probably already a composer, and they're not really there to talk to people who want to work with them on their next project. And they're probably going to be, the moment of interaction opportunity is going to be transient, transitory and brief, and difficult to turn into something meaningful. But on the other hand, if you were to volunteer for that film festival, now you're inside this community of people at that film festival. Or if you were to give a talk at that film festival, like if you know enough about film music that you could go and give a presentation about music at that film festival. If you were if there were a panel discussion and you were the moderator, now all of a sudden you're in these more significant relationships with those people, that might lead to more meaningful connections. But generally speaking, the way that you form these kind of relationships really is face to face, in my opinion. And I know that we have social media and we have the internet, but the problem with it is that the whole world is there, and so it's difficult to cut through the noise, and it's difficult to form meaningful relationships in that space, I think. And so, getting into the world and having face-to-face communication with the people you might work with or work for, leads to opportunities. I think it's more likely to.
Thank you
So,
for sharing
yeah,
that.
yeah,
I got a lot out of that
yeah.
myself.
Good. Yeah, yeah.
I think I'm pretty much at the end of my questions. Where can people find you and your music?
Good question. I mean, I think basically if you just Google me, stuff comes up, and you can find my music out there in the world.
Thank you so much for coming on today. It was a pleasure to hear about your experiences and your career in your life.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening and for your support of the composer's life. And speaking of which, if you like the podcast, please go ahead and rate it on whatever you're listening to it on. This helps other people find the podcast and helps me to be able to keep making them. Also, be on the lookout for when a new episode comes by subscribing and to watch for future very exciting announcements. Have a great day and talk to you next time.